following is from the Teachings of Gurdjieff, A Pupil's Journey by C.S. Knott. This is a continuation of Orage's commentary on Beelzebub. The peculiarity of beings on this planet is due to special conditions. These beings are unique, especially in the nature of their distorted reason. Why do I think that most of the people I meet are fools? Why do they think that I am a fool and pity me? And why are we both right? Why do we in our calmer moments recognize the essential senselessness of people? Why is it that it is so easy to see the faults in others and so difficult to see them in ourselves? This has always been known. See Socrates and the story of Sankuntala in the Mahabharata. This senselessness is taken for granted by the power-possessing beings and is used in their dealings with what they call the broad masses, or the people. Why do we find it difficult to behave reasonably when confronted with a body of people? Everyone recognizes that 75% of laws and regulations are stupid and tries to evade them, yet seldom does anyone protest. Heat and light are the remorse of matter. When we are in a state of self-remembering, elements in our body experience remorse, not a feeling of inferiority, but a kind of sorrow for what we are, combined with aspiration, and a light dawns on us. We can observe something in ourselves that had been hidden in darkness. It is sometimes said in modern physics that we are the products of electricity. The three forces are assembled in one: okidanok, electricity, positive, negative, and neutralizing. Gurdjieff says that 2 previous civilizations have gone down because of too much mechanical use of electricity. Ours may be the 3rd. Owing to this extreme mechanical use, there is less for psychological use, hence the will-lessness, the aimlessness of people. Education is affected. In our time, education leaves off where in ancient times education began, that is, between the ages of 18 and 21. The idealistic period when youth is waiting for something that will give more meaning to life than it sees manifested in those lives of those around them. At this idealistic period, life is full of electricity, but there is no one to show youth what to do with it. The result is that the most idealistic become cynical, become cranks, or take to drugs, or go in for an overindulgence in sex. They fall back on their instinctive moving centre. In the chapter Why Men Are Not Men, we are told that because of some unforeseeingness on the part of the higher individuums, a comet collided with the Earth and 2 pieces were split off. Organically, we are the product of the planet, and we reproduce the organic deficiencies of the planet. 2 centres were split off. Our nature became split. Zakaki came to Earth to investigate and found that it was necessary that the Earth and all life on it should supply the 2 satellites with a substance called ascuokin. This could only be obtained by sweat, by effort, physical, emotional, and mental. Every organism, every atom had to bear its share of the burden. Zakaki feared that the people on this planet, who were not perhaps sufficiently developed in reason, would revolt and refuse to have children, so the organ Kundabuffer was made to grow in them. This had the effect of making them see reality upside down. They took the ephemeral for the real, and for the first time they began to do something which was not done on any other planet. They began to destroy each other's lives, and nature received the help she needed. As soon as it was deemed to be safe, his endlessness had the organ removed, but the consequences remained. Man continued in his state of sleep, and from later Babylonian times, 8,000 years ago, he has slowly degenerated. We happen to be living in a period when the process of degeneration is being accelerated. Even from the 18th century it has speeded up. Why this command of God? In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Why this curse of labour, the need to sweat? Why this apparent malevolence of God? According to Beelzebub, it is not malevolence, but a cosmic necessity. No one can escape, everyone must pay, but its endlessness, almost from the foundation of the world, sent his messengers to the earth, and continues to send them to teach men how to pay nature, and at the same time to work on themselves and use part of their efforts for their own being. His messengers taught men the method by which he himself overcame the merciless Hieropaths. He gave them his only begotten Son, so that they themselves might become sons of God and help him in his divine purpose. This method, in various forms, was taught by all the great teachers. We have now the possibility of paying consciously, so that even the curse itself can become a blessing. Plato, who had learnt the method from Socrates and studied the systems of the priests in Egypt, said, "God's curses are our opportunities." "Ye are not your own, ye are bought with a price," said Paul. We are dual-natured, I and it, but we are only vaguely conscious of this state. As we are, the body is of no help to consciousness. When we have learnt to separate I from it, then we may make use of the body. In doing Gurdjieff's movements and dances, we are making use of the body. We are constrained to make an effort to be conscious. Why is the body not reflective of the mind? Why is there no correspondence between body and consciousness? Why are we like strangers in the body? Paul said, "The things I do, I would not. Those I would not, I do." Abnormality includes not only human nature, but all nature. The whole creation groans and travails, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Earth suffers for some cosmic purpose. If we ourselves meet misfortunes with complaining and self-pity, we suffer more and make others suffer. If we meet them consciously, we can make an effort to turn them to our advantage, to our highest use. It is not enough to suffer in silence. This may result in a state of resentment. Conscious effort produces understanding. Beelzebub himself had to sweat to understand what he already knew. Someone voiced the perennial question. While I am here, in the group listening to you, I feel with my feelings that all this is true. Here I feel that I can do, and that henceforth I will live according to the teaching. But I know in my mind that when I leave the meeting, all the old weaknesses will present themselves. I shall forget and live the same old way, repeating and repeating, until I come to the group again. From the tone of your voice, Orage replied, it appears that you are in danger of giving way to despondency, the 8th deadly sin. In this work it is as if one were beginning again and again. Each time you make an effort you acquire a little more spiritual muscle. Like a child learning to walk, you begin again and again, and this work is infinitely more difficult and complicated. But results are guaranteed. We must remember that because of the effects of the organ Kundabuffer, we suffer from a kind of spinal disease which affects us as opium would, hence our difficulty in making real effort. It has made us lunatics, and although the organ is now only vestigial, the results are still there. Generally speaking, we are born sane, but become insane through the influence of our elders, through the desire to do as others do, through education in the wide sense, that enemy of the human race. What is the real meaning of sacrifice and sacrifices? Beelzebub speaks a great deal about it. The great teachers and heroes sacrifice themselves for humanity. In some cases they are actually put to death on earth as a sacrifice, Jesus for example. And according to Beelzebub, Judas, who was the nearest to Jesus and the most trusted, sacrificed himself for the good of the other disciples and for posterity. I said, it has always seemed to me that there is something wrong or something distorted in the evolutionists' theory that sacrifices and fertility rites were the beginnings of the religious ideas of primitive peoples. It must be the other way round. The idea of a god or hero dying for the good of humanity became distorted, became mixed with distorted religious ideas. God became incarnated in the king, and the king was sacrificed. It is said that the death of William Rufus, for example, was a ritual sacrifice to the old, not the Christian religion. There are many examples of the sacrifice of a king or a priest to say nothing of ordinary men for the good of the people?" Orage replied, "There is much in what you say. It is possible also that in ancient times real priests understood that it was necessary at certain periods to have large numbers of deaths, hence the enormous number of animals sacrificed by the ancient Hindu, Semitic and Greek peoples. In the Mahabharata it says that the gods are fed by sacrifices. But what sacrifices? From one aspect we can take the slaughter of beings in the third descent as slaughter of innocent instinctive desires. Again, from one of the 7 aspects, the 3 centers of culture are 3 forms of yoga, each being destructive of the unity of the whole. The third descent is to the instinctive moving center, where innocent desires are sacrificed by Puritans, monks, ascetics of all kinds who suppress natural physical needs, instincts and wishes. Objective, instinctive duties are to be good father, mother, husband, wife, brother, sister, son, daughter and citizen. Ascetic yoga, in the wide sense, makes these virtually impossible. All this has a bearing on reciprocal feeding, the trogo-auto-ego-crat. In the Christian religion, the idea of sacrifice has degenerated into giving up things we enjoy. It reached its extreme with the Puritans, who passed laws abolishing dancing, secular singing, festivals, plays, bear baiting, and above all sex, because people enjoyed these. The Puritan, the most intolerant of people, believes that if a thing is unpleasant, it must be good for you. In this sense, we are all perverted Puritans. We will sacrifice anything but our mechanical suffering. But if we wish to progress in this work, we must sacrifice this mechanical suffering. Resentment, irritation, despondency, self-pity, sentimentality, all that represents our personality. The pangs of death of personality are the labour pains of the birth of I. Angelius Silesius said, "I myself must become Mary and give birth to God." We make an effort by pondering and sensing, through contemplation, to understand these ideas. And when we do understand, we have a sense and feeling of light. This is the true light of the Gospels which we receive through the tender mercy of our God, whereby the dayspring from on high hath visited us, to give light to them that sit in darkness. The light of understanding, how gladdening light, of his pure glory poured. Saints and poets have always known it. When we fail to understand, the sense of the impossibility produces an emotion. One exclaims, "Why can't I understand?" We are then like the snake biting its own tail in disgust with itself. But by striving to understand, we develop the real mind. For this it is necessary for all centers to work together. Primordial substance is one, but one is three: affirming, denying, reconciling, or positive, negative, neutralizing. Can you differentiate these 3? Briefly, in an atom of hydrogen, the protein is the positive, the electron the negative. The movement of the electron around the proton produces energy, the neutralizing. This is a highly metaphysical concept. We have 3 brains, each manifesting a form of electricity. A normal being is one in whom these 3 correspond. Nature has developed the brain of the planetary body almost to perfection, though we have spoilt it, but has left it to us to develop the brains of the emotional and mental centers. As such, we are abnormal. Yes is of the mind, no is of the body. The reconciling is of the emotions. Body knows the how of things. Mind knows the what of things. Emotion plus mind and body understands the why of things. Scientists are interested in how, not why. Any new invention, regardless of the harm it may do to humanity, is regarded as sacred by the masses. The modern superstition that knowledge is an end in itself is thus justified. An aphorism in the study house says, "Take the knowledge of the West and the understanding of the East, and then seek." Knowledge without understanding is the root of all kinds of evil. Understanding and I are one. To be able to stand outside oneself, this is the original meaning of ecstasy. Eastern mystical poets used erotic love as a similitude. In the height of sexual love they experienced a sense of being outside themselves, a non-identification, not, as among most people, what Gurdjieff calls palpitating self-oblivion. Nature will not help us to develop the second and third bodies. She has supplied us with the substances, and we, by the use of the method, can transmute these substances into material for the higher bodies. In the second descent, the story of engulfed Atlantis may be compared with the objective conscience, buried deeply within us, swallowed up in personality. Objective conscience is the function of a normal being. It is the representative of God in the essence. What is John the Baptist? It is objective conscience crying in the wilderness of the body, beheaded by external life. Beelzebub uses the superstition of the beings of this planet in order to carry out his aim. We, in this work, have to be on our guard even against teachers. The reason of ordinary man is so fantastic that teachers have to resort to tricks and even lies for a good end. Gurdjieff constantly plays tricks with us to compel us to use our reason. He has written an aphorism in the study house: "If you have not a critical mind by nature, your staying here is useless." We assume that Jesus taught the gospel of love for our good. It might have been for our good if we could have understood it, and still can be if we learn to distinguish between the three main kinds of love, though there are 7 in all, and learn how to practice conscious love. And when we have disinterred the buried objective conscience, we shall have an infallible guide. Jesus, no doubt, was aware of the ultimate effects, according to the law of the deflection of the line of force, the law of the octave, of the deleterious effects of mechanical love, which, like everything unconscious, is evil. According to the Greek text, Jesus himself used 2 different words when speaking of conscious and unconscious love. One of the chief purposes of a man is to develop from a substance called essence a special kind of reason, objective reason, which will establish him as a permanent brain cell of all life. Man, by attaining to objective reason, can help to redeem creation. Nature, says Gurdjieff, needs these relatively liberated beings. As we develop consciousness, will, and individuality, we take our place as one of the brain cells of the universe. The reason of ordinary man is the reason of knowledge. The reason of developed man is the reason of understanding. Instinctive reason we share with the animals, but have a higher type of it. Associative reason functions according to verbal associations. Of objective reason at present we know very little. Again, this can be developed only by the practice of being part dog duty. Objective reason is the opposite of mere intellectualism, mere philosophical speculation, which produce only monsters. Bernard Shaw once told me that when he was about the age of 25, he had a realization of nature's purpose in this respect, the development of brains. But Shaw worked chiefly with his mental centre, and he became a reformer, not a teacher. In the third descent there is also a hit against the self-indulgence and sentimentality of the Hindus and modern English in their attitude to animals, the negative emotion of sentimentality masquerading as humanitarianism. What is the poppy seed that Beelzebub speaks about in the narrative of his third flight to the planet Earth? What are its effects? Poppy seed made people invent values, made it impossible for them to see reality, prevented them from taking their own instincts and experience as a guide. Take the contemporary role of advertising and connect it with a number of things we do, things we obtain, things we desire, all of which yield us no being satisfaction. Add to this the craze for publicity. In the Mahabharata there are many references to the endless desires of man for ephemeral things. However many he obtains, there are always more clamouring to be satisfied. The useless wishes and desires of the organism are like the creeping buttercup, which, unless it is checked, will smother a mellow garden. The chewing of poppy seed begins in infancy when we take our parents and nurses seriously. Most children are the foreordained victims of the salesman. It goes on through life. If someone tells me a tonic truth which shows me something about myself, my vanity and self-love are hurt. I resent it. If he tells me something flattering, though it may be bad for me, I am his friend for life. How many people regard public celebrities as great people, celebrities who in private are vain, conceited and touchy? The masses worship dictators and regard as great men those who in reality are immersed in vanity, self-pride, self-love and egoism to the point of madness. We admire showmanship. H.G. Wells, for example, when young, read the books of C.H. Hinton, which were full of strange ideas. Hinton was a mathematician who put his ideas into the form of stories, scientific romances, but he was an indifferent writer. Wells was a good salesman, showman. He developed some of Hinton's ideas in The Time Machine and other books and made a name and money for himself. Hinton remained obscure. Only in the form of myths and stories can people absorb truths. Gurdjieff's other book on which he is now working, Stories of Remarkable Men He Had Met, are masterpieces of the short story in narrative form, stories containing fragments of truth. Apropos, Gurdjieff, when young, studied Indian philosophy and later read Madame Blavatsky's books, and in the course of his travels in India and Tibet discovered that 9 out of 10 of her references were not based on her personal knowledge. He said that it cost him several years of exploring to verify this. In Tibet he was not a foreign agent. He got himself appointed collector of dues from the monasteries for the Dalai Lama, and in this role was able to go into any monastery. He discovered instances of abnormal development, high elevations, what are called magic powers, but he says that he found little, apart from something in certain dances and ceremonies, which could be described as objective knowledge. Most of the powers developed by certain monks were diversions from the normal, interesting but not useful for a method of self-development for people of the Western world, such as he had in mind. But the life of the Tibetan people were far less spoilt and nearer to a normal life than perhaps any on the planet at the present day. It has been less subject to the deteriorating influence of Western civilization on the one hand, and to the destructive influence of communism on the other, than any other country. But the time is not far distant when the sea of mud, as Gurdjieff calls it, of these two forces will engulf the life of the Tibetans, as it is smothering the old life of the rest of the planet. During the journey to Tibet, Beelzebub relates how he and his companions had to make a ring of fire at night to keep away wild beasts. When we are in a state of self-remembering, we are safe from the attacks of negative emotions. When we are asleep, off our guard, at night, they attack us. Buddha taught the method. He taught his disciples how to bear the displeasing manifestations of others, but gradually they went off the path and eventually reached the heights of intellectualism, where life is not possible. In the West, too, there are people who know with their minds everything about Buddhism, but understand nothing with their being. Buddha, like Pythagoras and Jesus, was a practical workman, not merely a talker. We must apply the chapter on apes to ourselves. We are a sort of ape, caricatures of normal beings. There are extreme cases. The speculative philosopher, dealing in words and concepts, the priest, dealing in symbols whose meaning he has forgotten, the financier, who has forgotten the purpose of money and deals in it only as a commodity. They work with one centre. Consider also the volumes of writings on metaphysics the intellectual centre trying to produce by itself. Intellectualism is mere words and produces no effect on the emotional centre. Beelzebub takes some apes to Mars to see if it is possible to make human beings out of them. Can we, apes, by working in the method, become human, normal human beings? In the course of our existence as we grow up, essence, in which it is hidden objective conscience, becomes submerged, and there remains only personality, in which the free centres become separated. It is possible to be highly developed in one centre, rudimentary in another, and atrophied in a third. Before birth, the embryo repeats physiologically the history of the species. After birth, according to Gurdjieff, we repeat the history of the planet. Two centres are split off, objective conscience sinks, deserts appear, emotional deserts. The mental centre, which should be active, father, no longer seeks out the instinctive centre, which should be passive, mother, and so instead of producing a reconciling result represented by a child, the emotional centre, the mental centre, becomes, as it were, homosexual, titillation in place of breeding, words and words, mental masturbation. Apes are those whose activity is not according to objective reason. The yogi is another type, self-abstracted, occupied only with the mental processes. Not one of us here works with three centres simultaneously. We also deal too much in words. In this sense we are mechanical, hence sinners, coming short of the glory of God. Gurdjieff's tremendous power and being is the result of his living and working simultaneously in three centres. This is real work. At the Institute in Fontainebleau we are shown how to work with three centres. The movements and the dances here in New York are a means to this end. In Egypt, Beelzebub put himself into a certain being state called Saurpaticalnean contemplation, in which it was possible to read thought forms called Corcapatinilian thought tapes, left by previous beings who had attained objective reason. But they can be read and understood only by those who have attained the necessary degree of objective reason, like Gurdjieff, for example. Certain others, like some of the saints and mystics, may read them, but only accidentally and partially, and they are never fully understood. Certain pathological types may get a bit here and a bit there and make a mishmash of it. This idea may throw light on phenomena like automatic writing, visions, revelations. When Mabel Collins produced Light on the Path by automatic writing, Madame Blavatsky said that it was a translation of a very rare book unknown in the West. But the Theosophists did not have the method, and their teaching, lacking the discipline of the method, became thinned down to Professor Kishmioff's famous chicken soup. In the being state called Saurpaticalnean contemplation, Beelzebub learned about Belkutassi, founder of the Society of Akudans. One day, Belkutassi had a realization of a stupid blunder he had made, and instead of indulging in self-calming and putting it out of his mind, he began to review his past life seriously and impartially. As a result of his pondering, he found this incident no more stupid than other acts in his life, but, because more vivid, it seemed worse. How often have you and I done things so foolish and stupid that if they had been found out would have ruined something precious? Belkutassi, reviewing his life impartially, discovered that there was no correspondence between what he had wished to do and what he had done. There was always a contradiction between his wishes and theories and his actual doing. He concluded that he must be a special kind of fool, that it was impossible that his friends and acquaintances should be as stupid as he, for they all seemed to be so well balanced. He then questioned his friends, confessing his folly and asking them to condemn him. His sincerity disarmed them, and they began to acknowledge that they also were leading equally senseless lives. They formed a research society for the purpose of investigating the meaning and aim of existence, and to seek a cure for the insanity of being in possession of three centres, each of which spoke a different language. They began as a small private group, not to confess their sins in orgies of emotion, but to be sincere in the group, and to speak about their faults and weaknesses, and to try to observe them impartially. They reviewed their past lives and their current behaviour, and formulated the results for the group. Later they divided into 5 groups. Do you follow the meaning of this? Do you begin to understand how we must apply this to ourselves? One of these groups was concerned with mathematics in its broadest sense. Gurdjieff says that life is based on mathematics. All great art, great music has mathematics at its base. Thoughts vary in weight and rapidity, feelings in intensity, muscular movements in stress. Can you observe and tell the difference between these weights, intensities, stresses? To do this would be introducing measure into psychology. Modern psychology is only physiology. Who can measure and weigh in himself and differentiate between two thoughts? For example, Gurdjieff says, time is the unique subjective. Contrast this with the volumes of Alexander on space, time and deity, etc. Alexander says, time is the father of space. And in this so much is assumed as being understood, so much is fanciful and has nothing to do with me. Gurdjieff's phrase is so much weightier and at once makes a greater personal impact. In Indian philosophy it is often said, time is I. This is similar to Gurdjieff's phrase but of different weight. Emotion. Americans sometimes say I'm just crazy about it, where there is really only a small degree of interest. Those who have real emotions do not use superlative expressions for mediocre feelings. Those who have genuine emotions, even when speaking of an intense experience, will, if they can conceive of a more intense experience, continue to use the comparative. Can you distinguish between stresses? The difference, say, between 7 and 8 pounds weight? We must try to observe the manifestations resulting from our perceptions. We receive perceptions and manifest results. Another group investigated rates of vibrations. How can we, by conscious labour and voluntary suffering, raise the rate of vibrations in our own organism? The fourth group studied physics and chemistry. They observed, among other things, changes produced in themselves by the passage of perceptions. The fifth group studied phenomena occurring within themselves as a result of the working of the three centres. When they had made a study of the phenomena included in the 5 categories, they discovered that something else was necessary, and they decided to send out delegates to try to discover more advanced students than themselves. They went to Africa. Africa, in this context, is a sort of cartoon of the organism. But where is the instinctive moving centre, the emotional, the mental centre? There is also here a description of the ancient Egyptian system and method of self-development, of self-perfecting, and an explanation of Beelzebub's system. The one was admirably adapted to the people of that time, as Beelzebub's is to our own. Our emotional system is a climate, or a variety of climates. Can you chart the changing winds of your moods? Can you change from a low, damp, negative state to a bright, breezy day? The answer at present is no. While we remain as we are at the mercy of every person we meet, every event, every meal we eat. We are the sport of every wind that blows. The ancient Egyptian priests had a conscious aim. While teaching their students how to change the negative substances in themselves to positive, they were also making changes in the exterior life of Egypt by the use of examples of objective art. The Greeks called them masters of dreams, not victims. The Sphinx, for example, is a copy of the original which existed in ancient Chaldea. In the original figure, 3 parts were connected. A fourth was insulated by amber. The Egyptian Sphinx connoted interrogation. Why? It had no wings, for essence which stimulated aspiration was missing. The flowering of Greek culture was an indirect product of the contact of the philosophers with Egyptian schools. As a beautiful ordered garden does not happen by accident, but comes about because of a kind of conscious love on the part of the gardener, so does the flowering of real culture in any civilization come about by the work of a few conscious beings. Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Solon, among others, went to Egypt to study. If we ponder the sayings of Beelzebub and formulate them in our own terms, reason will have served one of its functions, to shorten the period needed for self-development, to provide us with a means shorter than arriving by trial and error through the senses. In the 5th descent, Beelzebub relates that he observed from Mars that the life of man was becoming shorter. He descended to Earth to investigate. In the then modern Babylonian degeneration of the psyche of man had begun. Previous to this, the conception of science in ancient Babylon was based on the development of the normal potentialities of man. It was taken for granted that one of the obligations of life was the development of the second and third centres, or bodies, just as ordinary education is taken for granted in our time. Life in ancient Babylon was organised for this, and art, literature, and occupations were subordinate to it. But when intuition and potentialities waned, mechanical means took their place. The objective science was supplanted by the scientist of new format, who has no intuition but an amazing command of mechanical technique. Knowledge of all kinds was accumulated and understanding waned. The new scientist became engaged, as I have said, in anatomizing the corpse of the universe, became preoccupied with how, not why, seeing everything through part of the moving instinctive centre. As it was then, so it is now, but intensified. Man, who was a sword, became twisted into a mark of interrogation. Can we, in this life, develop our emotional and mental potentialities, become Platos or Hypatias, which in pre-Babylonian times were normal? In this decline from intuition and understanding to rationalism came the decline of religion and the invention of the maleficent idea of good and evil. What is our worldview? Is the cosmos the result of pure chance? Do I regard it as being governed by an all-wise and benevolent being? Do I depend on a kindly providence? Do I regard it as a penal settlement or a vale of tears? Or do I regard the world as a school to which I am sent to acquire a certain understanding, a kind of gymnasium in which I can develop my potentialities? We should try to set down for ourselves our conception of life. A first reading of parts of Beelzebub's tales must be painful for some of you. It is like Egyptian hieroglyphs. Scientifically it sounds absurd, yet constant reading lifts the dark curtain behind which nothing perceivable seems to move. In the 5th flight to the earth, Nadir represents the highest form of ordinary reason, admitting that it knows nothing about after death. Incidentally, when I spoke about this chapter to Gurdjieff, he said that he was not a literary man, but that he has supplied material in Beelzebub from which poets and writers will make epics. It is absurd to attempt to arrive at a literal understanding of Beelzebub. It is a myth, and a myth is an allegorical monster to shock the mind, as an artist's symbol gives shock to the imagination. Constant reading of the book seems sometimes to stupefy the mind, yet, paradoxically, it awakens the understanding. Nadir read a paper on the instability of human reason. He was a first-class scientist who had been to all the schools, including Egypt. Like others, he assumed that the mind, like the hand, had been developed naturally by evolution in response to needs. But all his learning, study and training had not helped him to solve even one question that concerned everyone. What happens after death? He had written books on the subject which everyone admires. He admits that, listening to the theories put forward by the other speakers, in one state of feeling he could agree that man is only in a body, in another state that he was only mind, and in another that man had an immortal soul which would go to its appointed place after death. And now he admits to his learned audience that he has had no personal experience of this question, and that he understands nothing, and he invites anyone who has a method or a means to knowledge which he has not tried to tell him. No one speaks. Then, completely disillusioned, he goes out of the hall, sobbing, never to return. He retires to his farm to grow chungari, a bean food. That is, he goes to an esoteric school where he may learn to work on himself. His state is ours. At this point, Orage told us that as editor of the New Age, He had read everything in the East and West on religion, philosophy, psychology and science. He had read the Mahabharata through twice. He was the friend of artists, musicians, scientists, psychologists. He had met everyone in the intellectual world and was familiar with every theory, religious, scientific, philosophical, psychological, economic and political. And in spite of all this, he realized that with all his knowledge, he understood almost nothing about the meaning and aim of existence, or what happens at death. When he met Gurdjieff, he knew at once that here was his teacher, and at the age of 50, disillusioned with ordinary life, he gave up everything to go and work at the prairie at Fontainebleau. Hamolin-Adair, he added, is a cartoon of the disillusioned modern thinker, whose reason is insufficient for objective conclusions. Verbal reasoning, Orage continued, is based on experience of words. Formal reasoning, reasoning by forms, in Gurdjieff's meaning, is based on experience through the senses. A man who had read about camels, but never seen one, could enter into a long discussion about camels, but what would his opinion be worth about one kind of camel or another compared with the man who had raised camels? In our society, both kinds of reason are necessary, since the existence of society depends on people keeping together, and this depends on communication by words, which, for this purpose, are symbols. They are like tokens, paper money, in relation to the gold reserve. This paper has a use but no value, or rather a symbolic value. Verbal reasoning, like paper currency, is greatly inflated. We ought to be very clear about the merits and defects of verbal reasoning, since so much of what is called education, lecturing, preaching and popular writing is based on this. It is not backed by actual experience. Verbal reasoning is the intellectual centre working alone. No one here has yet remarked that our tendency to over-verbalize is caused by inadequate action of the thinking centre in its own place. The thinking centre is energy for objective reason, and failing this proper use, the energy goes into verbalizing. This energy is a form of sex energy, and our verbalization is said to be due to the misuse of sex energy, which should go to the development of objective reason. Study the chapter on apes. We cannot understand objective reason in the light of subjective reason. Objective reason means coming to the end of subjective reason and then having a totally different experience. Constant study and reading of Beelzebub can bring about a changed attitude in which we begin to understand and to reason on another plane. The end of subjective reason, as in the case of Hamolin-Adair, is complete despair. Fortunately, we have the method, by the practice of which objective reason has an opportunity to develop. Emotions and ideas persist, as do physical objects, but objects disintegrate faster than ideas. What remains of the physical objects made, for example, by the early Jewish race? Nothing, yet their religious ideas still persist and are still vital, though we may not know how to use this vitality. The same with the ideas of the ancient Hindus, preserved in the Mahabharata. What exists of the physical objects produced by those ancient Hindus? Nothing but fragments of buried cities. Yet the ideas in the Mahabharata will revitalize our literature hundreds of years hence. Verbal reasoning is dangerous because words are species, entities, a humanly created phenomenon capable of giving a sort of experience. Slogans like "all power to the worker" and "liberty" stir people's emotions, fill them with lively fantasies. When they do get their famous liberty, they immediately begin to take away power and liberty from those who do not agree with them. Speculative reason is of no value apart from its verbal discrimination. Gurdjieff rates it lowest because it does not lead into either formal or objective reasoning. We ought to make constant efforts to acquire the ability to discriminate between vegetable, animal and human ideas, which are ideas on different planes. Ideas and emotions have their place on a scale. There are emotions which expand being and emotions which contract being. It is a question of rates of vibration. Vivifying ideas and emotions have high rates of vibration. Someone asked, what is the intellectual type? Is Hamlet an example? Orage. No, Hamlet is an introvert who can hear nothing. The centres are connected by a magnetic tie which, when disconnected, brings about sleep, thus giving the centres a chance to rest from sympathetic vibration. The magnetic tie between Hamlet's centres had been worn so thin that he approximated sleep most of his time. His real complaint was, why, when my intellectual centre is so stimulated, cannot I feel the horror of this incest and murder? And why cannot I act? Each time we make an effort to bring our attention back to ourselves, to what we are doing, to remember ourselves, the centres become connected. Laws of association have application to practical affairs. For instance, concerning weight of thought. If you follow the expression of a light thought with a heavier, the effect of the first is destroyed. A sufficient interval between them, however, would have left the first untouched. Again, you may catch a hearer in the wrong mood according to his centre of gravity. The art of psychology will consist in the understanding and use of these laws and of the laws of vibration. As it has been said, a man should spend half or at least a third of his life in pondering. Halkdonis stands in relation to the assimilation of foods as pondering stands in relation to impressions. One of us said, a man must make an effort to resolve the struggle between affirmation and denial, or else the impression goes not to essence but just to his store of information. Orage. Yes, in other words, pondering is the neutralizing force of thought. Without this, the organism is left with only positive and negative deposits. Pondering is the weighing of ideas. Pondering should include clarity. Question. How is pondering different from meditation and contemplation? Orage. There are notes in the thinking scale, of which Sol is concentration, La is meditation, Si is contemplation. But each is still a process of thought in which the emotional may enter, and it must be present in pondering, which is motivated by the emotional centre, by the personal relation to the subject pondered. Pondering is essential thinking. If emotion were lacking, pondering would be only weighing. Pondering is establishing values by weighing, otherwise there is only clarity and logic. Question. How do you differentiate impulsive action from action due to pondering? Orage. What is weighed in pondering is inclination and disinclination as opposed to thinking, in which ideas and concepts are weighed. The contents of the emotional centre, likes and dislikes, are the units weighed in relation to the criterion of more or less being. Pondering is the assimilation of the third food. With the psalmist we can say, when I consider the heavens, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, I ask, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? This is asking after contemplation. What am I? The transfer of the note C of the thinking octave to Do of the pondering octave. Pondering is thinking with the emotional centre, its thinking subcentre, which is the seat of essence. This subcentre is said to be the most highly developed of the subcentres. Suppose that our state of being depends on our serviceability to the Creator, that our future being, our life, depends upon our creation of values contributing to the Creator's purpose. Not knowing the purpose, the meaning and aim of existence, these objective values are matter for pondering. On the supposition that we exist by the will of a being, the individual's question is whether he is producing the desired values. This question is not intellectual because my being depends on this understanding. In the book, distinction is constantly made between existence and being. Values according to likes and dislikes are infantile. Calculation according to the welfare of the planetary body is existence. The welfare or ill-fare of my being is contemporary with existence and at the same time is continuous. Pondering is an activity proper to being, that strain in the being which is related to continuous being. It can think, but I alone can ponder. A fine machine or body at the end of an existence may find being shrunk to almost nothing. When you consider that the Creator's being depends on the growth and development of the being of his creatures, you will see that he cannot be hostile to any effort that we make towards an expansion of being. A state of being is dynamic, moving towards fulfillment of itself. The subjective attitude towards this question is determined by pondering. It asks, what is my status, not just as a trogo-auto-egocratic machine, but in relation to the cosmos? It may be that when we come to the end of our planetary existence, we shall be asked, what is your state of being now compared to what it was when you entered this spell of existence? We might be compelled to endure another kind of planetary existence deserved by our degree of merit, perhaps one in the animal kingdom. Purposive thought is thinking with a purpose, with intention. This implies control, not thinking just by association. Control of the lower thinking centre by the higher thinking centre, of the formatory apparatus by I. The ordinary mind is constantly being diverted, stimulated by incoming impressions and the contents already there. The parable from the Gurdjieff point of view is a truth for at least 2 and usually 3 centres with interblended significance. Parables are the language, the speech of mythical figures who are conscious representations of fully developed beings. You know how we attribute more than verbal meaning to the words of relatively developed beings? Put more into them. For instance, there is the myth of Gurdjieff, who can't ask for something at dinner without some pupils thinking his request is parabolic, that he wants something else. In its octave form, the parable runs from allegory through the parable with an inclusion of its meaning, until it reaches the oracle, capable of translation in 7 forms. In the parable, the facts of one plane are made to correspond with the facts of another plane. In general, Gurdjieff's book is a mythological parable. When he writes of the dispersion of races, he is writing of centres, though this is more a form of allegory. The miracles told of in the Bible obviously did not happen as they are related. Some of them may have been the manifestations of the laws of a higher cosmos in a lower one. Some stories of miracles are made so plausible that it is as if they had occurred. A genuine parable must be read for understanding. Its inner significance does not show on the surface and is not on the same plane as the gross narrative. The mind that is brought to the written text is the intellect, which is not capable of understanding, but the mind that ponders can understand. Meanings change so much that even terms in the gospel are meaningless to us. Bread, fish, the upper room, and so on, are technical terms which we do not now recognize. Explicit meanings are of no value in the parable except in so far as they are in our current language, but the implicit meaning can always be arrived at. The question is, how can we find the key to a parable? What meaning would Gurdjieff's book have without the method? It isn't that some people who have never worked in a group would not get a great deal from the book, but that, without the practical experience of the method, the deeper meanings would not be found. What is the Bible without the keys? I suggest that the division between the Old and New Testaments has a parabolic value. The Old Testament is a triad, do, re, mi. Then there is the shock of the appearance of the universe incarnate, after which the narrative proceeds from the history of Jesus to the history of Christ, who was born in the interval. The Old Testament, then, should be a parabolic history of the development of man through the 3 lower centres, and the New Testament through the 3 higher centres, with, of course, correspondence between them. St. Paul translated some of the Old Testament stories into New Testament meaning. The story of Hagar, for example. Jesus referred to the old Adam and the new Adam. Promise means potentiality, and very few people in the Old Testament are said to have promise. The Old Testament is a historical parable, the New Testament a psychological parable. in the absence of a key, interpretations of much of Gurdjieff's book, as of the Bible, can be taken as nonsense. It is said in the New Testament that he who practices this method brings out of his treasury things both new and old. It increases one's inner mental resources, for one thing, and it should enable you to have greater resources of memory for use in the work. Question. Is Einstein's theory a parable? Orage. No, it is a code, not a language. In the parable, common terms are used. Question. What about Blake's prophetic books? Orage. They are elaborate allegory and poetic imagery. Question. How about Wagner's Ring? Orage. It is an allegory. Wagner started it as an amoralist and couldn't keep it up. He became a Christian, increasingly sentimental and beautiful and weak. Swinburne is an infantile atheist, like Henley. Bloody but unbowed. He is credible but not cosmic. In reading poetry, if you think what would be said or meant in prose, you get a double satisfaction. Music also has this double content, but most music, like most poetry, is just bombast. If you reduce Wagner to prose, you find that it is impossible platitude. Bach and Palestrina have something to say, Beethoven occasionally. Unfortunately, we are, in relation to music, as most children to poetry. If it sounds good, we think it is good. Question. Haven't we a right to expect an intellectual analysis of music? Orage. This is just what the poet says when he has nothing to say in his poetry. In exactly the way I'm now asking for the reading of the content of music, apart from its sonorous form, we should be able to read parables, ignoring what they ostensibly say, and getting back to the real prose meaning. A parable comes from an integrated statement. That is why we are not capable of writing them, or true fairy tales, which have as their content a cosmic truth. A question was asked about the difference between mentation and being mentation. Orage. Presumably sometime the term being mentation will be as commonly known and used as subjective and objective, which dates no further back than Coleridge, who got them from the German, though they are Latin in origin. The two forms of mentation spoken about in the prologue of the book become the two dynamic rivers of the epilogue. Hussein says, "Things are a-thinking in me." The mind is always a-thinking, and if we take a hand in it and direct the thinking, it is active being mentation. It is the result of an experience digested and made part and parcel of our being. In being mentation, we are mentating with materials, which, since they are part of experience, have an emotional element. Instead of dealing with words and their associations, which makes possible verbal logic, we have to use experiences and their associations, which make possible a being logic. Pondering I associate more with the wane of associations. Active being mentation is used in such mantras as, "I wish to remember myself," when with each word you call up the most vivid experience connected with that word, and then you are in a state of wishing to remember yourself. Formal understanding, understanding by forms, is brought about by being mentation. Gurdjieff frequently suggests that the value of being mentation is in the activity of gathering up all experiences, whatever subject you touch on. In verbal reasoning, we substitute association for real experience. We cannot yet explore the character of objective truth and the character of the technique for attaining this. We have reached the conclusion that we have two forms of reasoning, formal and associative, and the distinction is made without reference to objective reason. It is not possible to develop objective reason so long as our centre of gravity remains in associative reasoning. We have to go from formal to objective. The material of the language of gesture, posture, tone of voice, facial expression and movement is the material of formal reasoning, and the Gurdjieff method is designed to shift the centre of gravity to formal and then to objective reasoning by making use of this material. I said, "A constant reading of Beelzebub would in time bring one to this state." Orage said, "Yes, But if you work in the method at the same time, you should attain it very much quicker. No one can impart or explain to you the experience of objective reasoning. They can show the way, but you must work for it. We should try to distinguish between sensing and feeling and thinking, the three main forms of states. People imagine they know the difference, but they constantly confuse sensing with feeling and feeling with thinking. Begin by making a list of emotional states. How many varieties of anger, for example? Indignation, spleen, vexation, irritability, rage, fury, acrimony. A person in a state of self-remembering could observe and be aware of these various states without perhaps being able to define them in current terms. The Babylonian scientists of new format instituted word reasoning and put an end to the pursuit of being. They substituted verbal thought for trained intuition. We come into the world educable and become corrupted by words. Knowledge is no longer the outcome of being experience, but of crystallized concepts. There were two schools of morality in Babylon, the dualist or idealist and the materialist or atheist. The first assumed the existence in the world of two principles, good and evil. We find in ourselves the tendency to classify things thus, not only in relation to ourselves, but absolutely. It is natural for each species to classify things in relation to its needs or wants. This grass is good for me, says the horse. This brandy does me good, says the man. And this implies no judgment of the object itself. If I say, this is good in itself, I am applying my personal judgment. This double use of the word good is the cause of most of our confusion, and this false attribution of personal values we call morality. Although Gurdjieff has said that there is objective evil in the universe, nothing that we ourselves know can be said to be universally good or bad. In spite of our knowing this, none of us can refrain from using the words good and evil and feeling that we have some claim to pass judgment. This is a result of an educational system which originated in the time of Babylon. Subjective morality came in when objective morality began to decay. The second school, the materialist, came to the conclusion that there was no psyche, no being, no soul. To the modern behaviourist, socialist and intellectual, man is only a kind of animal who takes in impressions and excretes behaviour. They are preoccupied with external behaviour, with subtle psychology. The Gurdjieff system agrees that man is a machine, but this system begins where behaviourism leaves off. Man has the possibility of becoming a living soul, capable of achieving objective reason. In Beelzebub, one of the implications is the conception of a normal human being. We cannot conceive a normal human being by taking the average of individuals. This distinction between average and human is very important. A normal man is defined in the book, but this needs to be pondered for a long time before it can be grasped. Gurdjieff often says, "What I am saying now you will understand in a year's or 2 years or 10 years' time," although his statement is clear. In a normal world, a young man or woman at about the age of 21 would begin to find in himself, quite naturally, the development of that state of consciousness which we call self-consciousness in the real meaning of the term. He would become conscious of himself, aware of his body in the sense of being psychologically in possession of it, and it would happen normally, accompanied by devotion to certain interests. At about the age of 30, another phase would occur in which he would become conscious of the world he lives in, of this planet and other planets and his relation to them. This would vary with individuals, but the character of the phases would be the same. He would become, not as Gurdjieff says, a young man in quotation marks with a pleasing exterior and dubious interior, but a young man conscious of himself, aware of the purpose of life and his place and function in it. But on this planet, because of our abnormal life, the phases are more or less chaotic with many young people and are accompanied by periods of frustration and despondency. Nothing goes as it ought logically to go. Beelzebub set himself the task of discovering why this should be so. As I have said, he reviewed the history of the planet, as it is useful for us to review the history of our individual lives, and he found that a catastrophe had befallen the Earth. It had been split, and 2 fragments had flown off into space, the Moon and Annulus. Each of us repeats in himself the splitting, but the consequences, though serious, are not fatal, since its endlessness gave us the possibility of turning this misfortune to our good. Our fallen state is due to the consequences of the results of the organ Gurdjieff. This organ is now vestigial, but the sociological tradition continues the consequences. As a condition of normal development, this tradition must be seen through. It is impossible to attain to inner harmonious self-development through sociological ideas, through a synthesis of the knowledge we have acquired. All this is useless in the absence of the development of essence, the biological germ. Here is the origin of the idea of being born again, not in the current religious or occult sense, but in a return to the biological state before we were subject to sociology. This is where Gurdjieff's method comes in, a practical method for self-sensing, self-remembering, self-observation, for inner development. Essence is truth about oneself in contrast to social and expected opinions of oneself. Essence is truth irrespective of time, place, and the feelings of anyone. It is what one would dare to avow if no consequences were to follow on a statement of the truth. It is truth before God. Personality is truth before men, before the world, conditioned by what will people think. It is necessary to know what you really wish. As you discover your real wish, external circumstances will change and become more like those you wish. Wild animals live according to essence. In this, man is inferior to the animals. Domesticated animals have their essential impulses distorted. Sociology has distorted us. We were caught so young that it becomes almost impossible to discriminate between our native essential state and our sociological personality state. No civilized man can arrive at objective truth, and there is no possibility of inner individual development through ordinary sociological conditions. Society chooses what shall be actualized of our inherited essential potentialities. I inherit an instrument. I, as psyche, will develop according to my ability to exploit the possibilities of the instrument. But from early childhood, only a fraction of potentialities are actualized by the stimulus of environment, and perhaps for my whole life I am identified with that fraction. At the same time, every personality is in accordance with essence, though only a part of essence. If, so to speak, I am a piano on which only jazz is played, I go through my whole life thinking I am a jazz instrument. Or, if I become identified with the career of lawyer, for example, I exploit only a fraction of my potentialities. But it is possible to play one role as if you were identified with it, and yet not to be. Circumstances may force you to play one role throughout life, but so long as you are not identified with it, essence develops. In the ancient drama, the actors stood in the wings. On the stage, the play was begun. Those in the wings were liable at any moment to be beckoned onto the stage, with no intimation of the role they might be called upon to play. A man living in essence can do seemingly contradictory things, but all are related to essence. To be able to live according to essence, we must also develop reason. Question. If we acted essentially, shouldn't we act inhumanely? Orage. Not necessarily. A covered-up essence is not necessarily inhuman. Essence are often better than we think. There is not one of Gurdjieff's rules of objective morality that essence does not instinctively obey. For most people, the moon is a diabolical influence, and through the organ Gurdjieff does something to free-centered essences. It is as if essence, arriving from the sun and planets, on reaching Earth, receives a chill. From one aspect, personality is the guardian of essence. It is said that one of the Medici, trained in a Platonic school, lived in a nunnery for 15 years and became an abbess. then went back to court. She was able to play the role as long as her reason dictated it. If we had the means and the knowledge, we could trace hundreds of similar cases in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Gurdjieff speaks of essence, wish, and personality, want. Since I have a free-centered essence, which is a minute replica of the world, of God, in my essence I cannot have but the same wish as he has. I must discover what this essence wish is. There is a difference between subjective and objective conscience, and when you have experienced universal praise and have realized that it means nothing to you in relation to your objective conscience, then you will begin to understand the difference. Gurdjieff lives from essence according to objective reason. But to a person in ordinary life, the behaviour of a conscious man and a charlatan is often indistinguishable. Hence the stories that arise about Gurdjieff, and the animosity from hangers-on and some of the younger pupils. With the conscious man, behaviour is related to a conscious aim. With the charlatan, behaviour is unconscious. Will, consciousness and individuality. We must not flatter ourselves that we have the slightest idea what these mean. The nearest analogy for us at present is wish, or want, or desire, thought and personality. These determine for us the value of the abstract, unrealized, unexperienced terms. The difference between an ordinary wish or desire and will is the difference between a passive state in which an active force operates and an active state in which oneself operates. I myself do not originate the wish, it happens to me. Will is self-initiated. If, as Gurdjieff says, you take some small thing which you really wish to do and compel yourself to do it, you may then experience the beginning of a taste of real will. Every wish we experience can be regarded as a psychological entity, every impression a unit, playing the same role in our psyche as we individuals play in the life of the planet. Gurdjieff said that if a man can be anatomized psychologically, he would see myriads of beings, of wishes, thinking organisms. He would see his entire population. Personality is the sum total of our reflexes, physical, emotional, intellectual. Personality is a reagent. Individuality is the ability to act, not react. It is presumed that there is a being who is capable of using the body. One of the objects of the method is to make real the distinctions which at present we can make only intellectually. Question. Could we compare will, consciousness and individuality to God the Father, God the Son and God the Holy Ghost? The Holy Ghost being the reconciling force, but now a duplex person with the Virgin Mary, which would make the Son the reconciler instead of the Holy Ghost. Orage. This is one of the disputes of the early Catholic Church. Beings, said Orage, only become individuals or individuums, indivisible, three in one and one in three centres having been developed, when active, passive and neutralizing are in their normal order, a repetition of the original state of creation, every wish of which we are conscious derives from one of our three centres, and for the other two centres it is an apparition, an interruption. When all three centres have the same wish, this is what we call will. Then a man can say, I wish, with his whole being. It is I amness. When all three centres are engaged in one wish, you are not aware of a wish, the whole being consents. Psychological suffering ceases, but effort continues, with often a feeling of disappointment because of the frustration of will. With increase of being comes increase of difficulties. At the same time comes an increase of strength. One of the aims of the Gurdjieff method is the attainment of a state of self-consciousness, which now we assume, without evidence, that we possess. Gurdjieff does not assume, as the mystical and occult methods do, that we are self-conscious. Man has lost his way, fallen into his present state of pathological waking consciousness, and unless he can recover, the path is doomed. This method is devised to help him. All our physical and psychological manifestations are interrelations of our organism and its environment, devoid of will, that is, of the power to act on one's own initiative. So we have Gurdjieff's definition of a man. A man is a being who can do. From this it would follow that in general we do not know a man, but only men in quotation marks. If will-lessness is of the natural order, the question is, what kind of activity is necessary to develop will? It is difficult to convince ourselves to have a realization of the fact that all psychic and psychological phenomena are of the same order as physiological phenomena. The process of thinking that is taking place in me now as I talk, and that of you subvocally while listening, are as devoid of will as the sense of touch and physical contact. There is no more will implied than there would be in dream figures going through these movements. We don't presume that the dream figure is initiating its own activity, neither are we the initiators of the dream figures. They are not even puppets, but this would imply a puppeteer. Our state is that we are more or less dream figures on the painted vow that we call life. A pupil. But suffering is real. It depends upon what kind of suffering. In a dream, suffering can seem very real indeed, and sometimes you can recall it for a long time afterwards. In life, although we may recall the occasion, suffering of a year ago can be forgotten. Nothing dries sooner than a tear. One of the purposes of the myth in the book is to explain the influence of the moon and Gurdjieff. It is not surprising that man has no will. It is surprising that he believes he has. This persuading of man that he has will, against all the evidence, against scientific analysis, is one of the effects of Gurdjieff. One of the first results of self-remembering and self-observation would be to remove this illusion of will. At a certain stage in the practice of the method comes the conviction of will-lessness, the conviction of one's own inner nothingness and mechanicality, of the hopelessness of the expectation of anything real in ordinary life. This, in early Christianity, was called a conviction of sin, a realization that one had missed the mark. This psychological experience was necessary before a being could attain will or salvation. Assuming that the realization of will-lessness has been experienced, the question becomes one of whether it is possible to be born again and pass into real life, and by what means. And here, on the threshold, stands the word will. The question of will is said to be the mystery of mysteries. Real will, the force that creates, preserves and destroys the universe, is unintelligible to ordinary thinking. God, the Absolute, created the great universe by an act of conscious will, by overcoming inertia, inert matter. As we, in our small ways, develop real will, so shall we become like God, become sons of God. How do we begin? Again, I repeat Gurdjieff. Take some small thing you wish to do, which you cannot now do, and compel yourself to do it. Whim is the beginning of will. Whim is a fly, will an elephant. St. Patrick's effort to change the course of human history, to civilize Ireland, is an example of elephantine will. It is assumed, of course, that you have studied the method. Every effort to remember yourself and to observe yourself impartially is an act, a small act, towards the state of real will, the first step, in fact. At a later meeting, when good and evil were being discussed, Orage continually had to bring the pupils back to the point. He said, "Everyone here has questions and answers them from the centre of gravity in which he is at the moment. His interpretation depends on this only, on his subjective state. Essence takes the form of the being that at the moment is occupying the centre of gravity. It is animal, child, or barbarian, and every second the psyche is changing form, and it is to such beings that doctrines are addressed. You can imagine how such a being transforms a doctrine. having heard it in one or another of the three centres. No wonder that Gurdjieff is always speaking about the strange psyche of these three-brained beings. The difficulties of a world teacher are tremendous. No wonder that it took a son of God, and his doctrine has apparently failed, to explain to men a few simple ethical doctrines. The beings on the planet Purgatory participate in the divine plan, but suffer because they know what they ought to do, but are as yet unable to. When will, consciousness, and individuality are developed harmoniously and simultaneously, then, in the process, we are purged and may be released from purgatory. The development of these three at once is anti-yoga. Beelzebub tells us, saying that when the rate in one centre is too high to cease activity in it and bring up the other two centres under order from the fourth centre, this is Iram Samkeep. I keep myself in charge of the three centres. The Absolute, by definition, is the whole considered as one. The Absolute to which we refer is the whole of our world. This self-contained unitary Absolute presents two features, the status quo and movement, the static and dynamic features. These two presuppose a plan or design necessitating the maintenance and development of the universe. This development can be called the plan of campaign, and the status quo is the army for carrying it out. The plan has as its objective the development of the potentialities of all the constituent beings of the total plan. The realization of the plan is the attainment of objective reason, the fulfillment of the being of each being. The plan is to be carried out by all beings, conscious or unconscious, to the extent to which they remain beings at all, and not complete has-nas-mosses. A potentiality of beings is to be conscious of the plan and to develop the will to cooperate with it. The attainment of a state of conscious cooperation with the plan may be defined as good. Failure to attain this state may be defined as evil. The plan is discoverable, but in the absence of the discovery, all reports of its nature must be regarded as conventional or religious morality, subjective morality. Slavish obedience to subjective morality constitutes objective wrongdoing. The text of Gurdjieff's book claims that the principles of objective morality as laid down are derived from a prime source by a being who has had access to it. Each great religion, at its origin, has taught objective morality. A technique, a method is given, designed to bring into consciousness objective conscience, so that a being can understand and cooperate in the divine plan. With understanding comes the responsibility of a being for his own development. At present, the only objectively right thing we can do is to practice the method, which has the effect of bringing objective conscience into consciousness. The psyche is that which is not body. It is coated with the body. It is an entity, incidentally coated planetarily. Physiology is the instrument of the psyche. Within the psyche there is possible the development of the three centres. Psyche is the instrument of I. The concept of psyche does not include the physical body. The true physical body is the etheric body. Gurdjieff refers to the other as the planetary body. The four bodies, planetary, physical, emotional, mental, signify tetartorcosmosis beings. The planetary body is formed of planetary substances, the physical body of radiations from the planet. In the emotional centre there is a duality of substances, radiation from planets and emanation from the sun, which contribute to lower and higher emotions, symbolized in the cross. Every cosmos, including the Tatato, is a free-centred entity in which transformation of substance occurs. The Kesjan body and the mental body are the higher bodies. Question: how do you define presence? What is the difference between presence and personality? Orage: Gurdjieff associated presence with what is immediately present in you. It includes potentiality insofar as potentiality has begun to give evidence of itself. Of a young tree, he said, young presence. It is both the accomplished fact and the process of accomplishment, mass plus energy. Concerning chief feature, one of the characteristics is that you assume you are what you essentially wish to be. A feeling of sociological guilt comes from subjective conscience, a consequence of subjective morality. Being shame comes from objective conscience, a realization that one has failed to attain to what one should be. Unless we use our energies for normal psychic development, we literally become inferior to animals. The octave is the development of three primaries, the law of three. In the spectrum, there are only three primaries, red, yellow, blue. If as a simile we take red as positive, blue as negative, yellow as neutralizing, in man now red and blue are reversed. To a question about part dog duty, Orage said, "This is duty in three languages. It is conscious labour and voluntary suffering. From one aspect it is an intellectual duty to strive to understand the meaning and aim of existence, an emotional duty to feel the weight of the maintenance of everything existing, and a physical duty to make the planetary body the servant of your aim. I've never been able to bring home to you the feeling of the debt that each of us bears for our having been incarnated. Everything that we call natural is the product of being superior to us, provided at great cost so that we could have experience. Existence, the participation in the experiences of incarnation, costs somebody something. To feel the obligation of this is to have an understanding of what is meant by paying for one's existence. Not to feel this is a sign of abnormality and an incapability of any conception of justice. We place an infinite value on life, and a long life and a happy one, but first a long one. The obligation for our life is not one that should be felt, but that is felt by a normal human being." A pupil: "Then we come to Hamlet's to be or not to be." Orage: "Hamlet was not normal, but mad. His was a typical case of will-lessness poisoned by German philosophy. Think, we might all be tables or inferior animals, and, as life is shaped, the number of pleasant experiences, generally speaking, is slightly in excess of the unpleasant ones. Duty is defined by the Buddhists as that which must be done without expectation of merit, but which must be done if we are to earn merit." The beginning of adulthood is the wish to separate I from it. An adult is one who is striving to make this separation, to separate the self from the self. The adult may not be fully conscious of this separation, but the presence of this wish indicates an entering into the state of spiritual adulthood. Without I, no consciousness. People who have had moments of self-consciousness know the difference between these and waking consciousness. Cosmic consciousness is still different. It is not possible to describe it, so no records of it exist. Buck's cosmic consciousness describes only self-consciousness. Ouspensky related that he became convinced that he was not self-conscious when Gurdjieff asked him where he got the grease spots on his vest, and he could not remember. The difference between a thought and consciousness is that thought is a succession of images, a train or a sequence. Consciousness is a simultaneous awareness of the contents of the mind, and of course of the feelings and sensations. Presentation of a way of development is difficult because the conceptions are not familiar, axiomatic, or associative. Gurdjieff gets over this difficulty by writing parabolically. Direct exposition fails because of wrong association with psychological data. Radiation disperses by its own force. Emanation undergoes no diminution. A question was asked about organic shame and the loss of it with special reference to women. Orage said, "I have heard Gurdjieff refer equally to its loss in men. In fact, in one chapter he has passages in which he acquits women in America of the state into which they have fallen, for this decline started in men, and the women only make manifest the degree to which organic shame is lost in men. You know that the word Jehovah or Yahweh is made up of Yod and Evo, Adam and Eve. The Jewish religion is regarded by objective esotericism as degraded because it dropped the responsibility for evil from Yod and put it on Ev or Eve. These men who shift the responsibility, slipping from their active part to the passive, are men of Yod. The Sufis say that the Jews had the truth given them, objective knowledge, but they forsook it, and in consequence they have been punished and dispersed. Organic shame is not of an organ, but of the organism, which regards abnormality with fear. Only a normal organism feels this. To a question asked about appealing directly to objective conscience, Orage said, "This cannot be appealed to directly. Ashiata Shirmash appealed indirectly. Curiosity for a good aim, as Gurdjieff says, is a pure motive for studying the method of self-observation, because it does not colour it. In this respect we are like Saul, who set out to find asses and attained a kingdom. The method provides a mean of discovering and having a realization of one's abnormality. This inspires a wish to change, which is organic shame. This is connected with the holy A-I-E-I-O-U, the aspiration of lower vibrations to share the experience of higher vibrations. It is that which we feel in the presence of a superior being, not a superior social item. A wish to be such, this is hero worship, the hero being objectively superior. Our mechanical reaction to people is one of the signs of our servility. One of the psychological exercises within your control is the constant striving to be aware of negative emotions. During these past months, many of you have been going through an intense period of negative emotion. At the same time, you had in your hands the antidote, so to say. But we are also in love with our mechanical suffering, so lazy, so much in inertia, that we would rather suffer mechanically, passively, than make the effort to practice a little voluntary suffering. Regarding conscious labour, we can take Ashiata Shirmash. He began to ponder, by a whim as it were. He pondered all preceding teachings and eventually established a critique and a new technique. It was self-discovered. He found what his aim in life was through his own efforts, and he set to work to devise the most efficient means for putting it into effect. This was conscious labour. The Gurdjieff system defines an aim for every individual, which is the attainment of self-consciousness and the measure of objective reason. The idea is ultimately to be able to relate every action to purposive conduct, which alone can give meaning to an otherwise mechanical life. Real pride begins with the work of I. It is the being satisfaction of having made effort.